Reading 67 from the Psychological Commentaries on the Teaching of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky by Dr. Maurice Nicoll, Volume 2. Birdlet, March 31st, 1945. The reason why we have to observe ourselves. Let us begin by taking this idea that is taught us in the work, that higher centers are always speaking to us and telling us what we should do, but we cannot hear them. We may be quite sure that, since the object of the work is to connect us with higher centers and their messages, one of the first things we are taught, namely, to observe ourselves, must have connection with ultimately getting into contact with these higher centers in us, which are fully formed, but which we cannot hear. I mean that there must be some reason for self-observation, and I think that it is right to say that if we simply try to observe ourselves merely because we have been told to do so, we will not be observing ourselves in the right way. We will not understand why we should, or what deeper meaning lies in this practice. We shall then be inclined to say, why on earth should I observe myself? With what object? For what reason? If we have not a wide enough grasp of the ideas of the work and what the goal of the work is, if all these ascending scales shown in the ray and the side octave, all these teachings about higher level and lower level, fewer laws and more laws, and all that is said about personality and essence and so on, mean nothing to us conceptually, and simply lie scattered about in our memory, having no coordinated and emotional life in them, then of course self-observation will be merely a dreary task imposed upon us. But surely we have to get a much more subtle and interior idea of the work. Let us consider self-observation in the light of why we are told to practice it. We are told to practice it because it can lead to becoming more aware of the influences of higher centers. We cannot hear these influences because there is a kind of thick substance lying between them and ourselves. What is this thick substance? It is all that part of us that is unconscious to us, which we do not realize, which we are unaware of as existing in us. As you know, it is often said that the act of self-observation lets a ray of light into our inner darkness. This darkness is what I have just called the thick substance, which will not transmit the influences of higher centers. A man, a woman, must come to terms eventually with this dark side of themselves, and this is only possible through long and intelligent self-observation carried out for a definite reason and not merely as a mechanical task. Remember, all self-observation must be a conscious effort. You will agree that we all have in us eyes of which we are quite unaware. We live in a false personality, not in a real one. We are full of pictures of ourselves, for example, and owing to the action of buffers, which prevent our seeing contradictions, we feel quite at peace with ourselves. But the object of the work is to stir up a struggle in us, a struggle with this false contentment and complacency. And what is the method used? The method is self-observation, whereby we gradually become more conscious of what is in us and begin to lose these beloved pictures of ourselves, these forms of imagination. You remember how the driver is in the public house drinking. This means he is living in imagination, in pictures, in imaginary ideas about himself, in imaginary I. The first thing is that the driver must awaken. Now, we can think of the situation in the following terms. We each have a dark side to ourselves that we know nothing about. That is, a side that is not conscious to us, but yet acts. Into this darkness, a ray of light must enter through self-observation, carried out according to what the work teaches us to observe, to look for, to become aware of. This dark side of ourselves must gradually be connected with our idea of ourselves, and as it were, a pattern has to be made, a mingling of these two sides. And unless this ray of light enters this darkness, this cannot be done. And in consequence, we can never feel the influences of higher centers, because these influences are damped down and obliterated by this dark side, this other side of ourselves, which as a rule we see only in other people and do not attribute to ourselves. So we tend always to blame others and accuse them, let us say, of evil thoughts, or suspicious behavior, or bad talking, or unkindness, or lying, or indifference, or infidelity, or unreliableness, or meanness, and so on. That is to say, this other side of ourselves of which we are not conscious, we tend to see in others, and as you can understand, this is one of the great causes of human unhappiness, and the constant friction in which almost everybody lives in regard to one another. In order to alter this state of affairs, the work begins with self-observation, with letting this ray of light or ray of consciousness into this inner darkness. Here the teaching of the work is quite emphatic and cannot be misunderstood. When we study our tendency to blame others and register it and deliberately begin to try to observe the same things in ourselves, we are undertaking one of the first and most important steps in personal work, in work on ourselves. Unless we do this, we can get nowhere. If we attempt to get somewhere without doing this over a very long period, we are like people trying to see through a window that is covered with black paint. This black paint has curious properties because in some indescribable way, it is ourselves. It is a kind of living darkness in ourselves which can only be cleared away by the increasing light of consciousness through self-observation. The increasing light of consciousness is the result of long, quiet, sincere self-observation, long private noticing of oneself, of one's actions, of how one speaks, of one's thoughts and how one is thinking, of one's emotions and how one is feeling. It is clear, then, that the initial task in the work is to become more conscious of this dark side of ourselves, and this means we lose, little by little, all our ordinary ideas of ourselves, which we feel at first as a loss of personality, as a kind of weakening of ourselves. But yet, if one does not allow oneself to get negative, and this is very strongly emphasized, the danger of negative states being continually mentioned, then one begins to realize that in the new and strange feelings of oneself that begin to visit one, there is far more real strength and understanding than anything in the pseudo I that previously ruled one. We will indeed find that quite new thoughts, feelings, insights, and meaning begin to come to us, and the reason is that traces of higher influences begin to be faintly heard, so much so that where formerly we only saw one thing, one way, one meaning, one choice between what we thought was right or wrong, we now see a dozen or more meanings and choices. Where we thought there was only one step between Do and Ray and me, in some previous barren, rigid, and stilted understanding, we see whole inner octaves extending between these notes. All increase of understanding lies in seeing finer and finer differences, subtler and more beautiful meanings, all interwoven and full of a magic quality of their own, which we realize are quite different from our previous heavy, crude kind of thinking and feeling, whereby we formerly lived. But these finer visitations of understanding cannot enter our consciousness and become a continual internal source of meaning that never dies and is inexhaustible, unless we make this dark side of ourselves increasingly conscious. And as I said, this making conscious of the dark side of ourselves, or side in darkness, inevitably leads to a complete change in our idea and estimation of ourselves. Indeed, we may feel we are losing sight of ourselves, and where we used to be sure and convinced and so ready to do and act, to speak, to criticize, we now feel a great uncertainty because we see so much more in every situation than we saw before. It is not a negative uncertainty, but a positive uncertainty. It is not a feeling of helplessness, but a feeling of strength because we see so clearly that where we were so sure before, we were then very weak, because the certainty we felt was the certainty of a fool, the certainty of ignorance, which can only be a weakness and which no doubt continually led to wrong results and completely useless frictions, which we were sure were due to others and had nothing to do with our own completely untrustworthy reactions. How certain we used to be. But now we see how mechanical we used to be, how we used to think we understood everything and could do, and now we realize that we had no understanding, and in fact, everything simply happened mechanically to us according to the nature of our machine. How much we used to attribute to ourselves and pride ourselves on, and how much now do we see that it was all done by this machine that we took for granted as ourselves. Now, in seeing this other side of ourselves, this dark side, into which the work tells us that we must penetrate and make it increasingly conscious to ourselves by self-observation, you must remember that the doctrine of eyes is of the first importance in this process. We have to see this dark side, but not to identify with it. We have to make it conscious, but not take it as ourselves. This is a matter of great difficulty, and we have to remind ourselves and be reminded constantly of this point that is so important. Remember that everything we are taught in the work itself fits together, and you cannot do this work, say, with one idea of it, without taking in the others in conjunction. For example, you cannot take self-observation apart from the doctrine of eyes, without doing yourself great harm. The reason is that if to everything you observe in yourself you say I, and so identify with it, the result will be complete confusion. You will become what you observe, and this is fatal. We have to take our eyes objectively. We have to see different things in us as we see different objects in the room. We do not take the table, chair, the book as ourselves. We must never say, what I observe is I. But you must know that this I that you observe is in you. Now, all this belongs to not identifying. Self-observation carried out with the idea of not identifying with what you observe is the keynote of this system, practically, and it is a very difficult thing to carry out. In fact, it may be a long time before you see what this method taught in this system really means. You know you must divide yourself into two, an observing side and an observed side. You must not identify with what you observe. This is the same as saying that you cannot change if you identify with everything that goes on in you, with every mood, every thought, every sensation, every form of imagination. And again, this means that we have to take ourselves objectively. We have to take our psychology and all that lies in it objectively as we gradually observe it and gradually become more conscious of it. What does it mean to take a thing objectively? I do not take the table I am looking at subjectively, as part of myself. I take it as an object that is not me and that I am distinct from. This is taking a thing objectively. But the work teaches that we have to take the things in our inner life objectively. I notice, for instance, an evil, malicious thought in my mind. It is quite useless to burst into tears and say how evil and malicious I am. That would be taking the I that thinks like this subjectively as myself. It would be identifying with it, saying I to it, and this would be quite useless and would lead nowhere. On the contrary, I must see this thought and try to see what I or group of I's it comes from and watch what they are up to, what they wish to do and to make me say. Then I will be observing these I's objectively. Of course, if I consent to them, I shall become them, and they will rush out of me and do all the harm they can. If I try to keep them back by force, taking them as myself, I shall soon lose the battle, because then part of my force will be going into them, part of my feeling of myself. This will always happen if I cannot feel they are not me, and that they come round at intervals and try to persuade me that they are me and beg me to say I to them. If you touch them, they will at once take force from you. That is, part of your feeling of I will run into them. You then have, as it were, no magic circle that you can draw around yourself and stand in internally. This is why it is so dangerous to go to sleep for too long, not to work at all or think about the work or what one is doing in it. Sometimes people allow themselves to be for a comparatively long time unaware of the work. They step out, as it were, of any magic circle that they might have begun to draw around themselves, and then all sorts of eyes fasten onto them like so many leeches. And then before they know where they are, some ruffian eyes get hold of them, having, as it were, drawn some blood from them, and so claiming a blood relationship. That is why it is so important to have aim in connection with some eyes that one knows only lead to trouble and useless suffering. About certain things one must keep inner silence, the work says. What does it mean to keep inner silence? Unpleasant eyes may be chattering inside you and persuading you to argue with them. If you do argue with them, you no longer keep inner silence. You can speak to negative eyes if you are very careful how you do it. If you see them quite objectively in you, and if you are not astonished that such eyes exist in you. I think as we get to know this dark side, in the increasing light of consciousness, none of us can be astonished at the eyes we find there, whose existence we must accept, but with which we must not identify. To resume in brief, the meaning of self-observation is to make this dark self increasingly conscious and to mingle it gradually with our previous imaginary idea of ourselves. This brings about a complete change of the feeling of oneself and begins to dissolve imaginary I. At the same time, while the process of this annihilation of our attributes is taking place, we begin to feel influences reaching us from another source of meaning. These influences could not reach us before because there was this thick darkness intervening. We can think of this dark side as the other person in us that we tend to see in other people. When you begin to make this other person, this dark self, more conscious to you, it is no longer projected onto other people, and your whole relationship to other people begins to change. In fact, you see other people for the first time and you release them. You release them. However, you must realize that this applies to each of you. Do not start with the idea that your neighbor should change and release you. You must release him